So this morning we continue our journey into our emotional IQ based on the Pixar movie Inside Out. And we're going to take a moment to turn ourselves inside out today and look at the emotions of despair and the emotion of hope. I get to talk about despair, and Susan is going to share hope. That may be because I'm a bit older, a bit wiser, and maybe more jaded and cynical. I hope not. So the emotion of despair. I want to honor Joshua Santa Cruz, who's in the back right now, our music director, for his ability to bring forward songs that speak to our themes. And this was a song he suggested, Mad World. And Josh, in many ways, is such a gift to us. And the band really is such a gift. Charity and Dan, I think you're all gifts from the Spirit. But that song, Mad World, by Gary Jules, is, in my mind, the epitome of despair. The way I interpret the song, the singer or the writer, is feeling invisible, is feeling disillusioned with conventional beliefs, with work habits, with school, and shallow actions in general, the shallowness or the sometimes routine of life over and over and over again. And he observes that folks around him are like Stepford people. They go through the motions of life without really engaging with each other and without engaging with the world, not having any sense of interconnectedness. All around me, there are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces. The stark contrast between that which is familiar and that sense of disconnection from those faces. The singer or the writer feels an experience of rejection and a sense that those that he knows are devoid of emotional intimacy and the capacity to act or think or even feel. Most of the world, I think, in my interpretation of this song, follow robotic habits. It's obvious that the person that is writing or singing really wants connection, wants validation, wants a sense of belonging, and is surrounded by familiar faces. And those familiar faces, I think, even make the singer, the writer, feel worse, not better, because of the disconnect from the familiar faces. So anybody who's ever been in a family, and we all have been in families, or in relationships, knows what it's like to feel totally alone in that family and totally alone in that relationship, where there's little emotional, spiritual, physical, mental intimacy and stimulation. I think the writer is trying to find his or her own way and wonders if this individual is depressed or simply reaching a point at which he or she is seeking some way of breaking out of the mad routine of life and becoming fully true to himself or herself. All around me, familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses. No expression. Hide my head, I want to drown my sorrow. No tomorrow. Talk about despair. Despair is the feeling of not having hope. An old comedian by the name of Charlie Chaplin said this: despair is a narcotic. It lulls the mind into indifference. Isn't that the truth? I think Chaplin had something here, feeling despair, feeling hopelessness, feeling futility, a sense that it is simply not worth it in a way, which in many ways, at least as I see our culture and our world today, maybe that's the opioid crisis that we're having. Right? Is despair is the narcotic that lulls our minds into indifference. So as I was considering despair, and I think this is a wonderful image of despair from a theological viewpoint, because preachers like to do that. From a spiritual perspective, I wondered, what is my theology around despair? Well, I found this quote on an interfaith website, which I thought was fascinating. Despair of self is the door into religion. Despair of God is the door out of it. And I thought to myself, exactly. Despair brings an individual to God, to a higher power, to their knees, seeking something outside themselves. And despairing of God is sometimes the door out of religion and into self-discovery and into an experience with God rather than just religion or doctrine or teachings. Despair in my Godology or my theology is really the lack of possibilities and a lack of an experience with God. This, of course, is one of my very favorite scriptures. With God, all things are possible. And it's that loss of possibility in our lives where we see no way out, where we see no movement forward, that everything has become necessary to a person, or that everything has become trivial to a person. If you're a fatalist or a determinist and you're in despair, everything is necessary, and yet nothing is necessary. We've all heard the story of the king that died of hunger because all of his food was transformed into gold. The fatalist in his despair, God has been lost, the person has been lost, because there is no God, neither is there any self. So my direction or spiritual direction training as a spiritual director asks, where is God? That's the question my spiritual director, Amanda, always encourages me to ask as I'm sometimes in those places of despair. She says, James, ask yourself, where is God? Because you might be missing the presence of God. Amanda always encourages me to look for God in all situations, even in my fatalistic, mad world where there may be no possibilities and maybe where I don't see a way forward. So where is God in the middle of our despair in our culture and our society? Where is God in the middle of our despondency? I think God meets us in our honest, raw emotions. God meets us in our honest and raw emotions. Sometimes my consistent hidden understanding of despair claims that God meets me exactly in that moment of despair and hopelessness. God meets me as I walk through the valley of the shadow of fatalism and despondency and death and the madness of this world. That God meets me exactly in the familiar faces and the worn out places and the worn out faces. And in Jesus, I see on the journey to the cross, in our sacred reading this morning, we are told that Jesus falls 3 times from the Catholic tradition, that Jesus drops with a feeling of despair, unable to find his way forward in those moments of despair, but Jesus knows there's more to the story. Which leads us into Pastor Susan's reflection of hope.
Maybe Dickens said it best in The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Or maybe, and if you know this, you're showing your age, including mine and Pastor James, we know it, hee-haw. Anybody remember? We'll see if it works. Yeah, we're already singing it. Remember these guys?
Gloom, despair, and agony on me. Deep, dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me.
My wife was so unhappy she started to pack.
But I figured I could get us back on the right track.
So I give her a weekly allowance, but you fellas know how that is. So she spent it before I had a chance to borrow it back.
Agony on me. Deep, dark depression, excessive misery. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair, and agony on me.
Oh, yeah, they think they've got troubles. I just moved into a new town, and I got run over by the welcome wagon.
So I remember watching that with my father, most especially. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. But I think we have a choice. We can remain in that kind of agony and despair, or we can go forward and brave the pain and go through despair in order to restore our hope and reach the light again. Hope is seeing light in spite of being surrounded by darkness. The journey from despair to hope is really letting yourself fall, and fall hard. The scripture for today, one of them says that he carried his own cross. Talk about falling hard. The radical Jesus we know that challenged the powers that be faced deep darkness. I'm surprised that sometimes we think we can somehow be exempt from despair, that we can somehow avoid it. When we ask, why me? Why do I have to go through this? Well, why not you? Why not me? This is how we know life to be. We will despair. If we try to avoid it, we'll be left bitter, cynical, and jaded like Pastor James, or really angry. And we'll miss out. We'll miss out on the abundance of life. We'll miss out on the goodness of life. We'll miss out on really deep joy and the rich experience that we can have with God. And we know that that's what happens in darkness. That's those experiences and of the picture of that door, of having an experience of God in darkness. And we'll miss out on resurrection. As the scripture reading, the other one challenges us this morning. It talks about losing our lives. When you despair, it's like losing your life, albeit temporarily. Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." When you allow yourself to fall and to go through the darkness, you'll find your life again on the other side of it. Despair can lead us to cynicism. We see life as all messed up. We see everything as negative. We see life as out to get us. Last weekend, Rob Bell spoke in Mesa. He said that being cynical is easy and lazy. We will go through difficulties. And those difficulties, they shape us. They mold us, they change us, and they grow us. I don't know if you know this tradition, but when the Japanese mend broken objects, they aggrandize the damage by filling the cracks with gold. They believe that when something has suffered damage, it becomes even more beautiful. So as we were preparing together for this message, Pastor James was in despair, telling me about his broken pot at home. There it is. And he says he's still in despair about this broken pot today because somebody was visiting in his home and they accidentally knocked it over and broke it. The pot itself, oh, you want to talk? Go ahead.
Well, it's Casante. It was from my first visit from Casante, and it was one of those pots that really spoke to me, and then it broke. And I have such a difficult time with it, yeah. Yeah, in fact, the day we were talking about the message, I was in despair about it, because it sits there, and I'm like, oh, it looks so awful. But
yeah, and there's glue kind of dripped all over from trying to repair it again.
Not so good.
But if you look at that pot and its brokenness and trying to put the pieces back together again, it's symbolic of you and of me. We've undergone pain or worse in our lives. We've despaired and we will again. This should not surprise us, and we can't avoid it. We need not remain in that despair or remain cynical. So we are going to accentuate the cracks and the fragments. We're going to highlight the brokenness, and we're going to paint these lines of fracture. And we have gold paint to do just that. And we invite you that as we paint on this pot and accentuate and highlight its brokenness, that we invite you to remember areas of your life where you despair, areas and places of brokenness, not to wallow, not to weep, not to mourn, but to transform these hardships, these places of despair into beauty. The broken, fractured pieces, they shape you and mold you. They make you. They change you. They grow you and transform you. It is in darkness and despair that we experience God. It is in darkness and despair where hope is found. It is in darkness and despair where we are resurrected. It is in darkness and despair where we find our life again and we are saved. So we're going to paint. And as we paint, won't you consider your own life and places that need some gold around the fractures and brokenness?
I think what's interesting as Susan and I are doing this, and this is a bit unplanned, is that I realize in this way, this is an opportunity to take take the brokenness back, right? Own it, exactly, to own the brokenness. And now this pot for me has a completely new story. It's a completely new story. When it sits in my house, I'll know the loving and tender touch of my cohort in crime, Susan, right? And the gift that this was as we came together and as we suddenly had aha moments on how to really reflect on the brokenness and despair of life and how we find hope. So I think we'll leave the paint up here and the paintbrushes, and if at the end of the service you want to come up and do a little painting on my pot, feel free. I know, right? Yeah. And I'm the golden boy, right? Yeah. Yep. There we go.
We're going to close together with a quote that we're going to use as a prayer by Christopher Earl. I'd like for you to say it together with me and read together. I
Am a rock in a sea of despair and yearning. Take hold of me, and together we may form an island of hope and plenty.
Let us imagine together this island of hope and plenty and peace as we imagine a different world, and one where we take hold and own our brokenness and make it beautiful.